If you have ever been frustrated with auto-guiding a telescope for astrophotography, you aren't alone. Deciding between a dedicated telescope and camera or an off-axis guider with a camera can be confusing. I'm Aurora with ScopeTrader, and in this video, we are going to break it all down for you.
Astrophotography relies heavily on precision, especially when capturing long exposure images of deep sky objects. While the camera and telescope form the core of the imaging setup, they are only part of the equation. To achieve pinpoint stars and reveal faint nebulae or galaxies, accurate tracking over long periods is essential. This is where auto-guiding becomes indispensable. Auto-guiding helps compensate for the Earth's rotation and corrects mechanical imperfections in even the best equatorial mounts. No mount is perfect. Every mount, no matter how well engineered, suffers from periodic error and can be influenced by wind, vibration, or imperfect polar alignment. Auto-guiding works by locking onto a guide star and sending real-time corrections to the mount as it tracks the sky. This allows for long exposures of several minutes or more, revealing faint cosmic details. Without it, stars will blur or trail, and much of the image's clarity will be lost. As images become more advanced and attempt longer focal lengths or dimmer targets, auto-guiding becomes even more critical. Small tracking errors that are invisible at wide fields become pronounced at narrow image scales. As a result, many astrophotographers reach a decision point: how to guide more accurately. That decision usually involves a choice between two primary guiding systems. Off-axis guiders versus separate guide scopes in astrophotography is one of the most important comparisons to make when building a serious setup. These two systems serve the same goal, helping the mount track the sky accurately, but they do it in very different ways. An off-axis guider, often abbreviated as OAG, intercepts a small amount of light from the main telescope's optical path using a small prism. This light is directed to a guide camera that sees a small section of the sky, looking through the same optics as the main imaging camera. A separate guide scope, on the other hand, is a smaller auxiliary telescope that sits on top of or beside the main imaging scope. It has its own guide camera and observes the sky independently, in parallel to the main scope. On the surface, these might seem like interchangeable methods, but they behave very differently in practice. The OAG's greatest strength lies in its shared optical path with the main camera. Because both the guide camera and the imaging camera are looking through the same hardware, any mechanical movements affect them equally. This eliminates differential flexure, which is when two separate optical systems move relative to one another as the telescope tracks. Differential flexure can result from flexing of mounting rings, thermal expansion of metal parts, or cable drag. Even microns of relative movement between the guide scope and the main scope can produce trailed stars in the image. OAGs avoid this entirely because the guiding and imaging cameras are mechanically locked into the same optical system. Another key benefit of OAGs is the use of the main telescope's optics for guiding. This means the guide camera is operating at the same or nearly the same focal length as the imaging camera. Guiding at long focal lengths allows the system to detect much finer errors in tracking. This high-resolution error detection improves guiding performance, especially for small targets and narrow fields. The larger aperture of the main telescope also theoretically allows the guide camera to see fainter stars. However, the small pick-off prism in an OAG only samples a tiny section of the image circle, which limits the actual field of view and available light. This makes finding suitable guide stars more difficult. OAGs are also physically compact. They add very little weight to the imaging train and do not shift the center of gravity significantly. This helps with balance and reduces strain on the mount, which in turn can improve guiding stability. Especially for portable setups or mounts operating near their maximum capacity, this reduction in size and weight is beneficial. A particularly important use case for OAGs is with Schmidt-Cassegrain telescopes, or SCTs. SCTs and other mirror-based designs suffer from a phenomenon known as mirror flop. As the scope tracks across the sky, the primary mirror can shift slightly, changing the image position. A separate guide scope cannot detect this movement, because it is not connected optically to the mirror. An OAG, however, is looking through the same optical path and sees the same mirror movement. This allows the guiding system to compensate for mirror flop and maintain star sharpness in the final image. Despite these benefits, OAGs have a reputation for being finicky and difficult to set up. One of the most frustrating aspects of working with an OAG is achieving parfocality between the guide camera and the main camera. This means both cameras need to be in focus at the same time. Focusing the main camera is straightforward, but getting the guide camera to match requires adjusting the guide camera's position precisely. This often involves using spacers or a helical focuser, and even small errors can result in soft or unusable guide stars. Without sharp guide stars, guiding accuracy suffers and star trails appear in the final image. Another challenge is prism placement. The pick-off prism must be inserted far enough into the light path to collect enough light, but not so far that it casts a shadow on the main sensor. Too shallow, and the guide camera gets too little light to see stars. Too deep, and the prism blocks part of the main image, creating vignetting. This positioning often requires trial and error, and is usually checked by taking flat frames and inspecting them for shadows. Back focus is another critical limitation. Every imaging system has a back focus budget, which is the total allowable distance between the telescope's final optical surface and the imaging sensor. An OAG consumes some of that space. If there's not enough room left for the other components, like a filter wheel or field flattener, then the system won't focus properly. This is especially challenging with certain refractors and Newtonians that have limited back focus. SCTs, in contrast, usually offer generous back focus, making OAG integration easier. All these setup elements, prism depth, focus alignment, back focus spacing, are tightly connected. If one is off, it can make the entire system harder to use. Misalignment makes it harder to find stars, and limited back focus forces compromise in component choices. This complexity is what gives OAGs their finicky reputation. Another problem is guide star acquisition. Because the OAG prism covers only a small part of the field of view, and the focal length is long, only a tiny section of the sky is visible to the guide camera. This makes it much harder to find usable stars. This problem worsens when imaging in sparse star fields, like near galaxies or in narrowband filters. To improve the odds, users can install larger prisms or guide cameras with larger sensors. Popular choices include the ZWO ASI 174mmF Mini, which has a larger sensor area than other mini cams. Users may also rotate the imaging train to shift the guide camera's field of view. Another workaround is to increase guide exposure time or bin the camera to make stars more visible. But each solution comes with trade-offs in cost, complexity, or time. Filter placement is another key detail. If the OAG is installed behind filters, especially narrowband filters like HAR or O3, the starlight reaching the guide camera may be too dim to be usable. The solution is to place the OAG ahead of any filters, so the guide camera always sees unfiltered light. This simple configuration change can dramatically improve guide star visibility. Mechanical rigidity is also vital. All parts of the OAG and its attachments must be secure and free of flex or wobble. If anything moves, such as a loose camera adapter or a shifting prism stalk, the benefit of shared optics is lost. Even after a perfect setup, making changes like swapping a camera or inserting a new filter wheel can throw everything off. Users often find themselves recalibrating the OAG every time they modify their gear. In contrast, separate guide scopes offer a simpler and more forgiving alternative. These setups involve a small refractor or finder scope mounted parallel to the main imaging scope. They typically have shorter focal lengths and offer a wide field of view. This large field makes it easy to find guide stars in almost any part of the sky. Setup is faster and easier. Focusing the guide camera is independent of the main camera, and there's no need to adjust spacers or prisms. This makes separate guide scopes ideal for beginners or anyone looking for a less complicated solution. Another advantage is that guide scopes do not interfere with the main camera's back focus. They operate as a completely separate system. This makes them especially effective when shooting through narrowband filters on the main camera, since those filters don't affect the guide scope. Guide scopes are also portable and can be swapped between different telescopes with minimal effort. However, the biggest issue with guide scopes is differential flexure. Because they are mounted separately, even the most minor physical shifts between the guide scope and the main scope can create tracking errors. Sources of flexure include loose mounting rings, soft dovetail bars, cable drag, and thermal expansion. The result is that the guide camera reports perfect tracking, but stars in the final image are trailed or elongated. This problem becomes more noticeable with long focal lengths, where small errors are magnified. Rigidity is critical, and achieving it requires heavy-duty mounting hardware and meticulous cable management. Guide scopes also add weight and physical size to the system. This makes balancing more complex and adds stress to the mount. For smaller mounts or portable setups, this may be a deal-breaker. Focal length mismatches are another concern. If the guide scope is much shorter than the main scope, guiding accuracy can suffer. The guiding software may not detect small errors that become visible at the main camera's higher resolution. Modern software like PhD2 uses sub-pixel algorithms to improve guiding, but there are limits to what it can correct. A common rule of thumb is that the guide scope's focal length should be at least 1/5 of the main scope's focal length. Long focal length imaging scopes might require large and heavy guide scopes to meet that threshold. When comparing both systems, it becomes clear that neither is strictly better. Off-axis guiders offer unmatched precision and eliminate flexure, but at the cost of setup complexity and guide star limitations. Separate guide scopes are easier to use, cheaper and more flexible, but they are vulnerable to flexure and guiding inaccuracies. For SCTs and high magnification work, OAGs are often the only viable option. For wide-field imaging, or for those just getting started, a guide scope is usually more practical. Remote observatories present a unique challenge. Reliability is more important than theoretical precision. An OAG that cannot find a guide star or loses focus remotely can ruin a night's imaging session. Automating guide star rotation or guide camera focusing requires expensive hardware. In contrast, a well-mounted guide scope is more likely to find a usable star without user intervention. If flexure can be minimized with high-quality parts, a guide scope may offer better long-term reliability. But for extremely long focal lengths, even the best-mounted guide scope may not be precise enough. In that case, a carefully engineered OAG with a large prism and sensitive guide camera is the better choice. Choosing between the two requires considering telescope type, focal length, mount capacity, portability, and user preferences. Long focal lengths and SCTs benefit from OAGs. Short focal lengths and wide-field scopes do well with guide scopes. If you're on a tight budget or just getting started, a guide scope offers a lower barrier to entry. If you're chasing the sharpest stars at 2000mm and beyond, the extra effort of an OAG is worthwhile. In a permanent observatory, either can work. In remote setups, simplicity often wins unless flexure becomes a limiting factor. Ultimately, no guiding system exists in a vacuum. It must be paired with a stable mount, good polar alignment, and proper cable management. These factors are just as important as the guiding method. New technologies and sensors are improving the usability of both systems. If your current guiding setup is working, there may be no need to change it. But if you're struggling with star trails or want to push to longer focal lengths, it may be time to explore a new approach. Auto-guiding is one of the most powerful tools in the astrophotographer's toolkit. Choosing the right system is a step towards sharper, deeper, and more rewarding images of the night sky. Please subscribe to ScopeTrader.com and check out the full story in the link below.